Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully we're broadcasting live on Facebook. Says we're now live. Just give me a second to update my feed to make sure. We are. How is everyone doing this morning? Sana, can you talk? Can we hear you? No, we can't hear you. Ian, how are you doing?
I'm okay. A little tired with the time change.
Yeah. I woke up this morning and thought, oh boy, I've got an extra hour to do all sorts of work. And then I look at my phone and it's a different time than the clock in the bathroom. And it's like, no. We've sprung forward. How are you doing, Karen?
Okay, I didn't realize that in your countries there was a time change because we haven't had it. So I just got up and opened my tablet and it was happening. So I'm glad I realized that. I'm fine, but I don't know if you heard me say that I may have to leave early.
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Sauna's just asking. Actually, I can just answer it, Sauna. It's we had daylight savings time that started at the end of October, where we fell back an hour, and now we're back, I think, on regular time. So we've just sprung forward an hour. It slipped my mind. I was so busy yesterday. I should have notified everyone that the meeting was going to be an hour earlier. Because it's 10:30 here, it's 7:30 in Portland, Oregon. But really, our clocks would have been 9:30, so we are a little early. But at least we're going to get some nice light out during the day, and this is a nice time of year. They don't move forward in Mexico, Karen?
We do, but a different time later in the spring.
Okay. I'm looking forward to the day that we end daylight savings time and we just stay on the same time. It was done at a different era for a different reason. So how's everyone's inner work going? I didn't really make a big deal out of it. At previous years I have, where in Beelzebub Tales, Mr. Gurdjieff quotes a big confrontation between various people about which is the best diet and which isn't the best diet. And Mr. Gurdjieff said that the vegetarian diet is superior, but when vegetarians are surrounded by meat eaters, they can be overwhelmed a little bit from the society that they live in. But he said that ancient groups of people had learned how at certain times of the year to restrict certain foods. And he talked particularly, or he was implying that he was talking about the Orthodox, the true Russian Orthodox, the old version, not the new version, where they go vegan for Lent. And so I not only go vegan for Lent, I've been doing this ever since I read that in Tales, which has got to be about a dozen years now. But I like to start with a fast. And so last week it was Ash Wednesday. On Wednesday, Mardi Gras was Tuesday, so that's Fat Tuesday. And so I fasted for 72 hours. And I haven't done a 3-day fast in a while. I wasn't able to do it last year. And it got really cold here. And if you don't have food in your stomach, part of the digestive process adds heat to the system. And so it was really cold outside, really cold. And it was a really interesting exercise just in intentional suffering. And even now, it's not really intentional suffering for me to go vegan. I'm a vegetarian, so it's kind of like a quarter step up. But still, to be aware, to think of doing this for 46 days, to set yourself these little will tasks. And this is not so little. This is actually a fairly complex and lengthy will task. But I remember the first year I did it, it seemed like forever. And but since the first year and now, the number of vegan products or vegan products that are available in the marketplace have just is exponentially increased. So it's become easier and easier, and the suffering has actually gone down. But to try to do these things, to try to set ourselves will tasks. And, we don't need someone to point at us and say, do this as a will task. Find out places where we are a little rough, where we need a little bit of sanding down. In the last few weeks or the last week or so, I've noticed that I've had little flashes of anger. And I think anger was one of my primary emotions as a small child. To protect myself from my older brother and sister, I had to get angry. Until I got angry, they would keep on sort of tormenting me and teasing me. And so I think it goes way, way back. And I found just a couple of times, just the flash of anger rising up within me. And so to deal with that, I try to put myself in situations. I mean, there's other words for anger like frustration, impatience, annoyance. Impatience was always a big one for me. So to put myself in situations where I have to rub my nose in impatience, where I have to rub my nose with annoyance. It's like I turn the volume up on certain situations that stimulate this particular emotion in order to begin to lower the emotion so that I no longer am as affected by it. That's my little bit of a mini talk for today. How's the inner work going? We've got to always bring it back to ourselves, bring it back to our body. I was reading Roger Lipsy's book, Gurdjieff Reconsidered. It was my bedtime reading last night, and Rena Hands, one of his students who was British, who emigrated to Australia, talked about a time that he said when he becomes aware of his whole presence, it includes, the nail of his left thumb. And she said when he said that, she could see the nail on his left thumb almost being aware. And when you read about, the warriors and what Mr. Gurdjieff did after the warriors, when he kind of let the teaching and the intellectual side of things slide, he focused more on the inner work, on those pockets and moments of bringing ourselves back into this moment, to become aware of our body, to become aware of our surroundings. Any comments on the inner work? Any difficulties that you're facing? Any victories that you've had? Anything you would like to share? Not just with us, but with the people watching on Facebook and the people who may be watching later.
I could say something.
Okay.
I've been becoming more and more aware of how haste is the worst enemy to me because it keeps me from presence. It's deadly. And I see this hanging up the laundry. I want to hang it faster. Doing the dishes. I just want to get it over with. And becoming more conscious of doing the task is obviously a way helpful form of surrendering to the moment and enjoying hanging up the laundry, doing the things with the intention of this is a pleasant activity, because they're not unpleasant. I can shift them into something. I'm standing on the roof in a beautiful day. I'm looking out my window at the garden. So it's been a big sort of recognition more strongly than ever about haste and the dangers of it.
Haste is just doing things quickly. What is the underlying emotion behind that? Is it impatience?
Impatience, definitely, but not with any intentional reason. It's not like, oh, I got to hurry up because I'm going to do this or that. It's just there all the time.
So impatience is the thing that you need to work against. Mm-hmm. Is that true? Okay.
Yes, very true.
Can you set yourself a task that if you find yourself perhaps being impatient, that you slow down and take twice as long? I know years ago, I think I've talked about this before. In Toronto, the subways pull in and you can hear them. And then before the door closes, there's a ding, ding, ding. It's not quite as low as I say, but it's a 3-tone sound. And as soon as I heard the subway pulling in, if I was on stairs or in a crowd, I would start to bolt to try and get into the subway door. Or if I saw a bus coming, I would run as fast as I could for the bus. And I realized that impatience was a real problem with me. And so what I would do was I would let myself run for the bus, and then I would stop 15 feet away from the bus stop and let the bus go. And I would run for the subway. I would stand in front of the subway door, watch it close in front of me, and watch the subway depart. And I did this, it must have been about 6 or 8 weeks. And by the end of the 6 or 8 weeks, I had rubbed my nose into it so much that I stopped running for the bus. I stopped running down the stairs for the subway. You know, I don't like to be late. So rather than have to rush, I recalibrated my time and I left 10 minutes early so that I would always arrive 10 minutes early. But if there was a mess up, I wouldn't be late. And, you know, for all the bus and subway trips I took, maybe once or twice a year, there was a mess up on the system. And I had been tormenting myself, you know, the other 363 days of the year or whatever, with the fear that it was going to make me be late. And so the impatience came. So to try and set yourself some kind of task around that, you know, something, you know, for a decision exercise, there should always be some kind of punishment. And this isn't quite the decision exercise, but when you catch yourself in it, do something that counters it, that goes against it. I mean, there's no reason you have to rush with the laundry. There's no reason you have to rush with the dishes. It's not like you have a day that's micromanaged down to the minute. So this impatience that you were experiencing, it's actually rising from within you. I'm working with a client right now, and he thinks he has BPD, borderline personality disorder. I think he just has a problem with emotional attachment. He's in a state of attachment with his feelings. He's unable to detach from his feelings and separate from his feelings and look at his feelings from a detached manner. So I'm telling him to, you know, if he notices it, if he can catch himself, you know, what am I feeling right now? In order to answer that question, we actually have to inwardly detach from our feelings. And this is an attribute of the mindful state. It's an attribute of being personally conscious. I have to inwardly detach from my feeling in order to label it impatience. And then to ask, what purpose does this feeling serve, or why? Why am I impatient? And then to ask, is this an appropriate feeling? And if it's not an appropriate feeling, to then ask, why am I feeling this feeling? I say I don't like to talk about Tales too much, but towards the beginning of Tales, the person who started, the Society of Akkaldans, back in, according to the mythical Atlantis, in Beelzebub Tales, at some point he realized that something was wrong within him. And he began to analyze himself from the inside. And there's a wonderful description of self-observation in that section. If you've read that book, go and look at that section. If you haven't read that book, go and read that book. It's a hard book to read, but it's well worth the effort. But I think part of it was that a lot of our emotions are not appropriate emotions. So we're impatient when we're washing the dishes for no reason. So how am I feeling right now? I'm feeling impatient. Is this an appropriate feeling? No. I don't have to finish the dishes now. There's not something I have to do in 5 minutes. I've got plenty of time. Then why am I feeling impatient? And the why leads back, because I have this problem with impatience. I find myself impatient all over the place. So why am I impatient all over the place? And there's generally a cause for this. Unfortunately, the cause usually goes back into deep childhood. So we've got to then begin reflecting. What was it in my childhood that created this button, this trigger within me that leads to this feeling of impatience? And as a hypnotherapist, it's very easy for me to trace these feelings back with my clients when they are in the deep somnambulous state. They can remember where these feelings came from. Without the use of hypnosis, we have to do it more consciously. Perhaps meditate on impatience. Perhaps imagine ourselves as a small child feeling this feeling of impatience. Impatience is a feeling, and all feelings actually exist in the physical body, and we have a primary feeling circuit that generally runs from our stomach up to our tear ducts. I think it actually goes into the pineal gland, where the highest feelings. But somewhere along this primary feeling circuit, so our gut, our duodenum, our stomach, our solar plexus, our lungs, our heart, our thymus, our throat, our jaw, our mouth, our face, our eyes, our tear ducts, wherever we express the emotions, like we can get so upset, our voice, and we can cry, and the muscles in our face, and we can feel it in our heart, we can feel it in our gut, and we can feel the feelings all around our body. We can feel them in our hands and our feet. But to pay attention, where is this feeling in my body? Where do I notice this feeling of impatience? I discovered that I hold a lot of feelings in my face. Just the way I hold my jaw, the muscles and tension in my face. And to imagine then perhaps going back and being a small child, and do your best in a state of meditation to imagine being, say, a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, to imagine that you have like your 4-year-old arms, a 4-year-old legs, your 4-year-old body. If you have a picture of yourself at that age, look at that picture, try to remember what it was like to be in that body, and then imagine that you are in that body and superimpose, bring those feelings up where you feel them in your body, and ask your subconscious mind, where does this come from? As I said, I had burst of anger, and actually the burst of anger that I had this week was in relation to my sister, and it was such an unnatural, or not unnatural, burst of anger, but I don't experience bursts of anger like that much anymore. And then I thought, wait, she was in my childhood and she was 5.5 years older. And I know that I had to use anger as a mechanism when I was a child in order to stop being bullied. And when I thought about the communication that I had with her, it was through text. She was trying to get me to do something I didn't want to do. And in all fairness to my sister, it was her birthday, but her birthday came, and the celebration she wanted to have, at that point I had been fasting for 43 hours. And she said, oh, just come on over. And I'm cold and freezing. My stomach is just gurgling with hunger. I have a headache. And the anger shot up in that moment. So there was a moment of physical weakness, but it came from being told what to do. And in a little sense, I did feel a little bit bullied. So by tracing it back, by thinking about this, I can sort of go back to childhood and to imagine as a child, to get back to that point where, even if we just imagine a scenario that may have led to the feeling of anger or the feeling of impatience or annoyance or whatever. To go back, feel it in our body as a small child, and then release it, to just allow it to kind of dissolve. I mean, there are other ways if you can actually recall through meditation, through just putting yourself in a nice, deep inner state, if you can recall an incident, an event in your childhood where you felt impatience, to take that event from before you felt the impatience to after it was over, and to recast it in the second person. So, you know, see.
I'll definitely try that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just see baby Allan or see 3-year-old Allan playing in a sandbox. 3-year-old Allan's sister yelling at him, telling him to do something. See 3-year-old Allan getting angry. See 3-year-old Allan and his sister arguing, and then see 3-year-old Allan back playing in the sandbox. And by visualizing it in the second person, somehow this leads to an inner detachment of those feelings. This is actually, it's so simple what I'm talking about, this technique, but I do it with my clients all of the time. It's the bread and butter of the work I do as a hypnotherapist, recasting things in the second person, visualizing scenes, and not just going back into childhood. If you had a really, really volatile, upsetting scene.
I'm still here. I just have
okay.
I'm still here.
No. But if you had a really volatile, upsetting scene as a, you know, last week, one that you go over and over and over, when you go over and over and over it, you're actually in a state of attachment. You're in a state of identification. And if you can think of before that scene happened, all the way through to the end until when it finished, and recast it into the second person. In other words, create a movie in your mind with yourself in the movie. You will detach from it much quicker. This is how I help people overcome grief, overcome breakups, to put it into the second person, to allow that bit of digestion. At any rate, let's
thank you for that.
That's no problem, no problem. I want to do some inner exercises, but I'm going to do some that are recorded. People who are watching this on Facebook, people who may watch this on YouTube. I want to direct them to the fact that on the YouTube channel, the Gurdjieff Group of Toronto, I've got some recorded inner exercises in the Gurdjieff Tradition. I'm going to put them into a playlist. I don't have them all in a playlist yet, so there will be one place you'll be able to find them. This is also as a playlist on the Toronto Hypnotherapist YouTube channel as well. So I'm going to, these are the inner exercises. The first ones that I'm going to do, let me just share my screen, comes from Paul Beidler, who was one of Mr. Gurdjieff's students. There's a man by the name of Ian McFarlane who lives in England. He's actually from Toronto. I've never met him. He has a website called endlesssearch.co.uk. And he was a member of the Paul Beidler group for a long time. And a person who's in my Tuesday evening group, she came to another meetup group that I had, and she mentioned Beidler's name, and I went, "You're in the wrong group. You've got to come to my Tuesday evening group." She knows Ian McFarlane very well. For 15 years, every 6 weeks, a whole bunch of them would pile into vans in a car in Toronto and drive down to Pennsylvania to Northern Forest, where Paul Beidler had a place, and they would spend the weekend there doing inner work, inner exercises, and then he would give them written sheets of stuff to do back home. Some of the exercises that she said Paul Beidler made them do were really strange. One of them was to shave their eyebrows and not tell anyone why they did it. Another was to get up in Burger King or McDonald's and start singing. Another one, and this was back in the 80s, before we had ATMs and whatever, was not to carry any cash around. And they would be, and they weren't judged on it, but they were told to try to do these exercises for 6 weeks. But the exercises that I'm going to do from the recordings right now, and I'm going to end with the collected state exercise. These are all come from the Paul Beidler. The first one, sources of divine rejoicings, revolts, and sufferings. Direct your actions on us. Notice how I put the positive, negative, and equalizing signs, the law of three. Wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling. Again, the mathematical symbols, the law of three. Transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy God, holy firm, holy immortal, have mercy on us. Again, the law of three. So these inner exercises all relate to the law of three. And the first one, it's called the 12 joint exercise. We have 3 joints in each limb. So in my arm, I have 3 joints. In my left leg, I have 3 joints. In my right leg, I have 3 joints. And in my left arm, I have 3 joints. And it goes through each joint with a word. So sources begins with my right wrist, of my right elbow, divine, my right shoulder, rejoicings, my left hip, and so on. The holy God, holy firm, holy immortal, they use the actual various limbs and the spinal column and skull. So we would say holy with the right lower leg limbs, and imagine the marrow illuminating, and God with the upper right leg, holy with the pelvic bone, moving around the body. And the holy affirming, holy denying one, I'm going to do the 60 point, or the 60 bone exercise. We've got 3 bones in our thumbs, 3 bones in our fingers. So each hand or each appendage, like hands and feet, have 15 bones. So we go through that 3 times. And I'm going to start this now. And I'm doing this with from a recording so that people can realize that these things are online. And until you learn them, it's just a good way to get them into your brain. So I'm going to move to sources of divine rejoicings, revolts, and sufferings. Direct your actions upon us. And I also have to say that these 3 prayers are all found on the same page in Beelzebub Tales, and they're all in the chapter, The Holy Planet Purgatory. But these and and the page before, or the half page before, is a very interesting section to read. And these prayers, as I showed a little earlier, they're equivalents to them. I'm just going to try and expand this slightly and just begin. So let's do this all as we begin to follow this. And I'm just going to pause that one for a second. As noted there, it was a moving exercise. So you're walking down the street and you're blah, 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 blah. Your internal dialogue is going on. You're not present in your body. You're in a state of waking sleep. By doing this exercise, when you are walking, when you're gardening, when you're moving, you're actually using the head brain and the body brain, the sensation of the joints in the body brain, and bringing that attention to your head brain or to your joints, to the parts of your body. And so it's a two-brain exercise. And Mr. Gurdjieff said that, when we bring two or more of our brains together involved in the same task, we actually help ever so slightly to prolong our life. He called them mechanisms, contrivances, ways that we can do this. He explained this in a little bit more detail in Catherine Boom's Conversations with Gurdjieff, which are just typed up notes stored at a university library, where he talked about how joining the two centers or the three centers helps to slow the aging process. And that's a wonderful exercise to do when you're out walking, to bring that awareness to your body and to cycle through. And it can lead to very interesting results. So the next one is...
Alan, real quick. I don't know if we were supposed to, but the last one we didn't have any audio. And Sona was asking about it on the chat, so I'm just kind of mentioning that for her.
Okay, there's... sorry about that. Let me just do... Maybe I will go and do the last one over again, if I can, because this is important. I think I know the problem now. Thank you for telling me. Whoops. Okay, I'm just going to set this up. Thank you for telling me. I wish I had. And there's a button that I'm supposed to do for all of that, which I hadn't done. Okay, we're going to do this over again. Let me do the share. Share. Whoops. Stop sharing. Let me do the share sound. That's what I didn't do. Okay. This one's just like a 2-minute one. I guess I've done the introduction and talk, and we will just flow from one to another.
Revolts and suffering.
Can you hear this one?
Sources of divine rejoicings, revolts and sufferings. Direct your actions upon us. This is a walking exercise, though it can be done when sitting. Bring your attention to each joint and silently repeat the word. Sources of divine rejoicings, revolts, and sufferings. Direct your actions upon us. Sources of divine rejoicings, revolts, and sufferings. Direct your actions upon us. Sources of divine rejoicings, revolts, and sufferings. Direct your actions upon us. Holy God, holy firm, holy immortal, have mercy on us. Say the words, sense your bones, and visualize your marrow illuminating. Practice this exercise when walking, sitting, or lying down. Holy God, holy, firm, holy, immortal, have mercy on us. Holy God, holy, firm, holy, immortal, have mercy on us. Holy God, holy, firm, holy, immortal, have mercy on us.
And let me just stop this for a second. I just want to say that that exercise can also be done, and I've got another version on it, with holy affirming, holy denying. There are 10 words in the holy God, holy firm exercise. There are 10 words in the holy affirming, holy denying. So we can also do that one. We can do it both ways. And I'll come back to this.
Sources of divine rejoicings, holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. This is the 60-bone exercise. Become aware of all 3 bones in each finger and toe, and repeat a line from the holy affirming prayer in the following sequence. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying, holy reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. Holy affirming, holy denying,
wholly reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiate in me for my being. And I just want to say here, the next exercise I'm going to finish with is the collected state exercise. And I've done this live before. I give a slightly more elaborate version than the one here. The one that I'm going to play next, the collected state exercise, is virtually verbatim the English translation of the exercise as Mr. Gurdjieff gave it to one of his students during the Second World War when he was in Paris.
Seems like
Represent to yourself that you are surrounded by an atmosphere. Like the earth, you also have an atmosphere, which surrounds you on all sides for a meter more or less. In the atmosphere, the associations, the thoughts produce waves. It concentrates at certain places, it recedes. It has movements according to the direction which you impart to it. This depends on the movement of your thought. Your atmosphere is displaced in the direction in which your thought goes. If you think of your mother, who is far away, your atmosphere moves towards the place where your mother is. When you do this exercise, you represent to yourself that this atmosphere has limits. For example, 1.5 meters, shall we say? Then you concentrate all your attention on preventing your atmosphere from escaping beyond the limit. You do not allow it to go further than 1 meter or 1.5 meters. When you feel your atmosphere quietened, without waves, without movement, then with all your will, you suck it into yourself. You conserve yourself in this atmosphere. You draw it consciously into yourself. The more you can, the better it is. To start with, it is very tiring.
So that was Mr. Gurdjieff's description of that exercise. So imagine we are surrounded by an atmosphere. Meter, 1.5 meters. Keep it calm. Keep it still. Whoops, sorry. Keep it still, keep it quiet. And I'm going to count from 1 to 3. And when I get to 3, just suck it in. 1, 2, 3. And then as you breathe out, imagine something remains that settles within you. And Mr. Gurdjieff said that the collected state exercise is the ideal way to finish very specific inner exercises that we do. Not walking around if we're trying to bring our awareness back to our body, but when we're doing a sitting exercise, when we're doing an exercise in the morning, to finish with the collected state atmosphere, and then to breathe it in and imagine that the emanations settle within ourselves as we breathe back out. And then he also said it's very good to end inner work with an affirmation. May results, so in your mind, say, may results from this exercise be transubstantiated within me for my being. And then, just slowly return. Are there any comments, any questions? The teachings are one thing, and they're wonderful teachings. They're a wonderful understanding of psychology, of cosmology, a wonderful way of looking at our life, understanding the levels of consciousness, the process of awakening, where we leak energy, all the attributes of sleep and whatever. But it's the inner work that really counts. I'm just reading Roger Lipsy's Gurdjieff Reconsidered, a book that I recently was given a PDF copy of. And he talked about, dividing Mr. Gurdjieff's work into a number of phases. There was the ultra-intellectual phase that occurred with Uspensky in Russia between 1913 and whenever it was, he had to leave Moscow. And then when he went to Tiflis, it began to change slightly. And as he moved from Tiflis to Constantinople, it also began to change. There was a little bit more of an emphasis on the practical dimensions, on the practical efforts required. And then from Constantinople, moving to the priory or the prieuré in Fontainebleau in France, just outside of Paris, it became more of an institute. And he wanted to create something that he said sinister there. He wanted to accelerate the conditions that people would find on Earth. And then he had the car accident, and the car accident immobilized him. And he said that it was as if he had been reborn after the car accident. And then he focused on his writings. He realized that in order for these teachings to reach future generations as yet unknown and unborn at that time, he had to commit these teachings to writing. And I should also mention that in Search of the Miraculous, Uspensky titled it Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. Mr. Gurdjieff insisted that he write that and made him write it, and that was completed by about 1924, at about the same time as the car accident and Mr. Gurdjieff beginning to write Beelzebub Tales. Mr. Gurdjieff, through intermediaries, made copies of Beelzebub Tales available to Uspensky, who refused to read them. He wouldn't even look at the pages. And Uspensky said if that was ever published, he would destroy fragments, which we know of as In Search of the Miraculous. And he repeated this threat over and over and over. And Mr. Gurdjieff really had to outlive Uspensky. At that point, In Search of the Miraculous, Fragments of an Unknown Teaching fell into his wife's hands, Madame Uspensky, who had always remained devoted to Mr. Gurdjieff. Mr. Gurdjieff was always her teacher, and she took the manuscript and gave it to Mr. Gurdjieff, who said, I hated him, now I love him. And he affirmed the accuracy of his words in that text. So In Search of the Miraculous is that first phase of the teachings. The experiment that he did at the priory at the Prieuré, that only lasted for a couple of years, was a second step. And he had the car accident, and then he dissolved that. I guess he realized that something about that wasn't working, that there were too many people who were coming to the Prieuré, not with the proper intent. And, you know, I don't know, maybe it was just too much, it got out of hand. For whatever reason, he dissolved that phase. Not only did he go into a writing phase, but he also went into a composition phase, where he would whistle a tune that he heard. And then Thomas de Hartmann would play it on the piano, and they would flesh it out. Now, an interesting thing in the Roger Lipsey book, Roger Lipsey said that he and his wife were in the Himalayan mountains, and they heard a Tibetan girl or Nepalese girl singing a song, and it was one of the songs that came through on the Gurdjieff composition. So he was able to authenticate that a lot of the songs, and there were over 200 recordings, were recordings, and some of them we can imagine Mr. Gurdjieff made up on his own, but some of them he heard in villages, he heard in out-of-the-way places. And so he was able to intellectually embed his teachings in Uspensky's mind, which then took fruit In Search of the Miraculous, which Uspensky titled Fragments of an Unknown Teaching, but a publisher said, oh, people will never go for that in English, and changed the title after Uspensky had died. And then the next phase was the Prieuré, and that was a very brief phase. Some of it just in memory and in the words of people who were there, like Catherine Mansfield, who died there. Big scandal because she died there of tuberculosis. She was dying anyways. But, he tried to do various things there. He had his car accident, and then he said he was reborn, and his life began again at the car accident. And then for the next quite a few years, he devoted himself to writing, particularly writing Beelzebub Tales and writing Meetings with Remarkable Men. And he was going to write a third book, but he never got around to it. He gave some lectures, and he told his family they could put it together into that third book, which we know of as Life is Real, Only Then When I Am. But that wasn't fully the book that he intended to write. For some reason, he abandoned that. But when the Prieuré went bankrupt around 1933, he moved into another phase, which was when he accepted his first group of students again. This was the Ladies of the Rope, or the Women of the Rope. It was primarily a lesbian group with Solita Solano, Catherine Hulme. Jane Heap was sort of a peripheral member, but she was more in London at that time, and various other women, Miss Gordon. It's interesting, I forget who it was, Catherine Hulme, and I forget who the other ones were. They discovered that Mr. Gurdjieff would do writings in the Café de la Paix, the Peace Cafe in Paris. And they once went there and they saw him, and they introduced themselves to him, and they told him that they were in Jane Heap's Paris group. And then they went back every day and sat away from him and looked at him. And they did this day after day after day until he finally invited them to his table. Then he invited one of them to come to the Prieuré to help him close it up or do something. And he invited them to a crayfish dinner. And then they began to regularly meet at the Café de la Paix. And also in a few other places they began to meet. And some of these women, like Jane Heap, Catherine Mansfield, they were really sharp intellects. And they would have these meetings with Mr. Gurdjieff. And then when they left, they would go together and they would spend hours arguing over exactly what he said and writing it down to get an agreement. And we now have these transcripts available of what he said back then. That was another phase of his teachings. You could see that he was experimenting, that he was doing different things. And then the Second World War came. And it's like everything else kind of went into the background. And he really just focused on trying to awaken people. He left the teachings behind, he left the theoretical framework behind, and he began to focus again on the movements and which he called sacred temple dances. He never called them Gurdjieff movements. I've told people who have taught movements they should call them sacred temple dances. It would be a lot more appealing. People would be more open and interested in them. And he really, in the latter part of his life, he focused on the movements and on the readings of Beelzebub tales. He wanted people, he really paid attention. And one of the things he said, people of the ladies of the rope or the women of the rope, said was that, he would make them read sections of from tales, and he would be studying their faces, looking for reactions, watching how it affected them, and then he would go back into the text, edit it, make changes. Beelzebub Tales is a profound 250 plus page hypnotic script. It's designed to put you into a hypnotic state. It's like the Bible in that sense, with all the begats and the begottens, and you go into a trance when you read it. And so he was looking for it to evoke very certain reactions. So that was an experiment that he did with the women of the rope, or the ladies of the rope, the women of the rope. The women of the rope is the one book that is basically pure transcripts. Ladies of the Rope was written by William Patrick Patterson. I'm not a big fan of William Patrick Patterson because he editorializes too much and he puts himself into the books too much. He doesn't take a pure scholarly approach, and you have to sort out what his editorialization is and what really happened. And at points where I've been able to compare what William Patterson says about certain stories, like such as J.G. Bennett from Witness, and what J.G. Bennett said in Witness, you can see the real editorialization and how he focuses on certain things. To me, that makes him a bit of an unreliable witness. So there are those two books, The Women of the Rope, that is just the transcripts, and The Ladies of the Rope, the book written by William Patrick Patterson. I recommend Women of the Rope, the transcripts. They're very fascinating. Mr. Gurdjieff was also in a bit of a dark phase. He used words like shit or merd and said nasty things to shock them and to awaken them. And according to Roger Lipsy, Gurdjieff reconsidered. He'd never really been in so much in that phase before, and afterwards, he wasn't really so much in that phase. So a lot of what is written in those transcripts can appear very shocking. That was a period, again, another experimentation. And then during the war years, it must be remembered that, when World War II broke out, Uspensky skedaddled across the Atlantic to the safety of America. Mr. Gurdjieff's students had it arranged for him to drive to Spain, take a ship from Spain to Cuba, and spend the war in Cuba. He was actually in America in 1939. They told him not to go back, to stay in America. They had, when he was in Paris, they had the tickets for the steamliner to take him to Cuba. And at the last minute, he said, "I cannot abandon my French students." This was something I was going to talk about today. During the Second World War, Mr. Gurdjieff, and even after the Second World War, ran a soup kitchen out of his back stairs. And he kept a neighborhood alive. He kept a lot of people alive during the Second World War. After the Second World War, there's a story of Fritz Peters being with Mr. Gurdjieff, and this elderly Russian lady approaches him, and she's got something wrapped in newspaper, and she unravels it, and it's a terrible painting. And apparently on Mr. Gurdjieff's walls, there are all these paintings that were supposedly hideous. And he looked at the painting and he asked her about it. And he showed a great deal of interest, what she was trying to do in the effect. And then he gave her 1,000 francs for it. And Fritz Peters realized that some of these people had been aristocratic Russians who had fled the Russian Revolution. They were in poverty, and rather than begging Mr. Gurdjieff for money, they realized that if they made him paintings and different things like that, he would buy it from them to save their dignity. He was forever doing things like this, constantly in service to other people, to his students. If you said, Mr. Gurdjieff, can I study with you? Or however that was done, heaven help you. You were between a rock and a hard place, and it was like a vice that was squeezed tighter and tighter. And he could behave in such a gentle manner towards you one moment and an abysmal manner in the next moment. And all of these shocks and everything were designed to keep you from falling asleep, to bring you back to the present moment. Treating you in an abysmal manner, a lot of people would begin to get into a state of emotional identification. Why is he doing this to me? And then as soon as they stopped, as soon as they detached from that emotion and didn't allow his rages or what he was saying to affect them, he would stop and smile and nod at them. So it wasn't like he was consumed with these rages, with these angers. He was playing a role, he was acting, and he was trying to awaken them. And this is what he did in the last phase of his life. He left all of the teachings, all of the theoretical framework behind, but I also think he realized that those teachings and the theoretical framework was already there, and people would discover it, and they would learn it. So he never allowed anyone to take notes of his meetings. In the early years, Uspensky had he had almost like not a photographic memory, but an audiographic memory, like a tape recorder memory. And Mr. Gurdjieff wouldn't allow him to take notes of the meetings, but as soon as the meetings were over, he would write down what had been said. And then he would share those notes with people at the meeting, like Anna Butowski and various other people. At the initial St. Petersburg meeting, there were only 6 of them, and other people came and left. Anna Butowski's, I forget the name of the book, with Gurdjieff, Gurdjieff in St. Petersburg and Paris, a wonderful addition to understand a bit more about the scenario and what went on. You understand the meetings that Uspensky went to a little bit better from her perspective because she was at the meetings. And so he would write down everything. People at the meetings would go, yeah, that's what he said. And then he would share them with Mr. Gurdjieff's other students in Moscow and whatever. In this way, Mr. Gurdjieff also got to read them. So when Mr. Gurdjieff ordered him to, or asked to write In Search of the Miraculous, Mr. Gurdjieff was well aware of all of the very detailed notes that Uspensky had taken of the teachings. So he had embedded the teachings in Uspensky's mind and basically tasked Uspensky with being the record holder of those meetings, writing them down. The most important book in the teachings, as far as I'm concerned, is In Search of the Miraculous. But with the students, starting with the 1939, as the approach of war and war came, Mr. Gurdjieff allowed someone, he insisted that someone make transcripts of these meetings. Roger Lipsey said it's almost as if he was aware of his impending mortality, and he wanted to make sure that this was also included in the record. So Lita Solano, who went and saw and spent some time with Mr. Gurdjieff after the war, was a little upset because some of the exercises he gave to newcomers, she said that they had to do back, 1935, 36, when she was one of the women of the rope, they had to do like 6 preliminary exercises before they were given that advanced one, and he was just releasing the advanced one. And so Roger Lipsey speculates that Mr. Gurdjieff was aware of his impending mortality, his coming death, and he was allowing transcripts to be taken because he wanted to add another dimension to his teachings. And the Paris wartime meetings, one of the most important additions to the teachings. There's a book now that 1943 has been expanded in the Paris transcripts, there are 8 meetings. I think they've expanded it to all 20-something meetings that happened in 1943. It's a wonderful book. G.I. Gurdjieff, Paris Meetings 1943 is the name of that book. There are more transcripts. Hopefully the Gurdjieff Foundation in Paris will release them. So we can see the nature of the work changing, the nature of what he was doing changing. He realized that Ouspensky, and I'm sure Madame Ouspensky probably sent him copies of what we know of In Search of the Miraculous back in the 20s. I'm sure that if Ouspensky had destroyed it, other copies would miraculously appear. At a certain point, I think it was like 1929, Ouspensky said, either you choose Mr. Gurdjieff or you choose me. And if you choose me, you can no longer have any contact with Mr. Gurdjieff. His wife, Madame Ouspensky, went to Mr. Gurdjieff and said, I choose him. And Mr. Gurdjieff said, no, you go back to your husband's. And she was the one who ran everything behind the scenes with Ouspensky. He would appear for lectures and to answer questions, and the running of everything she was responsible for, and she had been at the Prieuré. She modeled it all after what Mr. Gurdjieff had taught her. So I think she was a spy in the camp. And if you read C.S. Nutt, particularly his second book, you will realize how Mr. Gurdjieff opened up and had a back channel of communication directly with Madame Ouspensky. So I believe he was fully aware of what was in Ouspensky's manuscript, and he may have had a copy of it before it was officially presented to him. So unlike a lot of teachers who get up in a lecture hall and they teach and they give lectures, Mr. Gurdjieff had the intellectual cosmological framework that he taught to Ouspensky. Then there are the practical inner exercises. Some of them we know, and one of my goals has been to gather as many of them as I can, and I've got 10 on my website. Then he also embedded his teachings in the music. If you haven't heard the Gurdjieff de Hartmann compositions, they're all over YouTube. Just type Gurdjieff de Hartmann, and you will come across a lot of the compositions. I bought the 3 CD set of just the piano music of these compositions, recorded, I believe it was, in 1952 by Thomas de Hartmann. He sat at the piano and he played them, and they had a recorder, and you can hear the creaking of the pedals of the piano, and there's a little 4-minute where he talks about Georgy Ivanovich, and it's him playing those original compositions, only the piano, which he helped to create with Mr. Gurdjieff. Now they've got things like the Gurdjieff Ensemble, which play it with traditional instruments, and there are people who do it with the piano and whatever. The teachings are embedded in the music. And then he also embedded them in the dance, in the movements, and to his students after the war, to the transcripts that were made. And he wanted all of his students to write books about their experience with him. So we've got Catherine Hume's Undiscovered Country, a wonderful book. We've got the Fritz Peters book. We have the C.S. Nutt. Then we've got people like Solange Klosters, Becoming Conscious with Mr. Gurdjieff. Apparently, reading the Roger Lipsey book, there are a number of books that I wasn't even aware of. I'm going to have to try and track down and perhaps purchase, of the French students who were with Mr. Gurdjieff during the occupation and after the war. So this teaching has been spread out. It's not just him lecturing. It's not him just writing. And we can't forget Tales. Tales is the most extraordinary book. Now, there's something I just wanted to share with us that I found in the Roger Lipsey book. This was something that I read this passage last night, and I posted a link on my website. not my website, my Facebook page on eliminating, the word Trump from any Facebook posts. I'm a Canadian. American politics, it's Trump, 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 Trump. And there's actually a Chrome extension. And there were people who said, I can't believe that you don't like Trump and, you're just one of these left-wing people and whatever. And I read this as I was going to bed last night. And this comes from Roger Lipsey, the book Gurdjieff Reconsidered. And the prayer comes from Louise Powell's book, C'est que je crois. And Roger Lipsey, during the war, Gurdjieff once shared with his French pupils a vow or prayer which he must have wished them to adopt as his own. And the I wish to be, I can be, we've heard elements of this before. This is in a talk that he gave in New York to his American students. That's in Life is Only Real, Then When I Am. This is an expansion of it. It's a slightly different flavor of it. I wish to be. I can be. I have the right to be. I have the ability to be. I swear to myself that this will never be for my personal profit, but to help others. I wish to be to help others. This is to be understood as a vow. And people have often said, the Gurdjieff teachings lack heart, and where is love in this? And Mr. Gurdjieff explained that there's mechanical love, there's mindful love, and there's awakened love. And, a lot of people thinking, oh, love, 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 they're just machines running around. And he said that when you point out flaws, when you adopt a position of absolute sincerity with the people in the work with you, it may seem harsh to outsiders, but you're really doing that to help them perfect their being, to work on their flaws. So sincerity is a deep form of love. It just doesn't seem like, oh, I love you, and the wonderful, mushy love that people generally think of as love. But I think this is the heart of the teachings. I swear to myself that this will never be for my personal profit. And Mr. Gurdjieff makes a big deal between two words, personal and impersonal, and another one is subjective and objective. Personal and subjective are of the ego. Ayn Rand's philosophy of selfishness, how selfishness is good, that is pure ego. It's pure subjectivity. It's pure personal. Personal, subjective, as opposed to objective and impersonal. I swear to myself that this will never be for my personal profit. So it will never be for my ego, for my self-aggrandizement. It will never be for me, my mind. It's done in service. So we grow our being. We grow our inner bodies. We grow our inner self so that ultimately we may be of service to others. And here, but to help others. And then I wish to be to help others, to break free from the confines of our own egotistic limitations, to break free from how is this going to help me? Are they going to pay me? Where's the money coming from? Mr. Gurdjieff talked about shearing sheep. And by this he meant trying to get money out of his followers. He said that the two biggest corns people have in the West, and corns are bunions. We don't experience a lot of them anymore because we've got better fitting shoes nowadays. But when shoes weren't that well fitting, if they didn't fit properly, you would develop bunions, and if they were touched, you would go, ow. And he said the two biggest corns were about money and sexuality. And so he liked to press those corns with people. And, you know, some people say, oh, he's just a money grubber, but Mr. Gurdjieff kept people alive. At the Prieuré, there were all these Russians who followed him, who didn't speak French, who couldn't earn a living. He not only supported them, he supported his family. Students who didn't have any money were allowed to come and study with him, even though they didn't have any money. Mr. Gurdjieff, they talked about seeing the threadbare cuffs of his clothes. He wasn't dressed in the finest suits. So organizations, bastard organizations, excuse that term, illegitimate organizations like Fellowship of Friends and their ilk, the people who belong to them, believing that you should be in three-piece suits and that you should drink the best wines and whatever. This was not Mr. Gurdjieff's personal philosophy. The money wasn't for him. It was for the work. He didn't live like a rich man. He gave of himself from morning until night to his students, to helping them. He spent hours in the kitchen preparing meals with an exactitude, with a scientific awareness that food is the first medicine. And not only did he give the food to the people who came to study with him, but to the people in the neighborhood as well. It was never about him. What he did, when you think about what he did from 1913 to the end of his life, where he ended up, the effect, the shock that he had on the Western mind, it was quite remarkable. None of this philosophy of selfishness. It was about compassion. It was about helping others. The tirades that he would supposedly get into could be turned off in the blink of an eye in order to, once his students realized what was going on. So it's important to recognize all of this, that we are not doing this work for ourselves. We are not doing it for personal gain. And I think that this was one of the fears, that if you develop the inner body, if you develop a Kesdjan body and you haven't properly developed conscience, that you can then become Hasmanus. I'm not pronouncing that right. You can become a nasty human being, and you can influence other people. And service to the world, service to others, service to humanity. I wish to be not for myself, but to help others. It's very important to understand the goal of these teachings. When I studied Hinduism, the one I focused on was very much a fourth way philosopher by the name of Sri Aurobindo. And he said that there were two schools of thought, one that believed in transformation, and it was transformation within the world to help the world. And the other school of thought was liberation, to escape the world, to escape existence. And the liberation is very much a world-denying philosophy. I just want to escape. I want to merge with the universal oneness. I want to return to the source. Whereas the process of transformation was to transform myself here in the world, to be of service to this world. And the transformation in the world was world affirming. It was acknowledging the importance and the reality of this world around us and trying to be better beings, to awaken more, to grow our being, to help the world. Any questions, any comments? Here I have been talking again. I wanted to just talk about that comment and put it in a better perspective, and to give a little bit of an overview of Mr. Gurdjieff's work, the different phases, how it wasn't just embedded in rigorous intellectual teachings. It was embedded in the inner exercises, in the music, in the movements, in the minds of all of his students, who they shared it with other people. Some of them wrote down in books so that future generations could share it. I believe that Mr. Gurdjieff realized that it was very important that he was, and that there are hints and there are places where he said it, that he wasn't teaching so much for the people around him as he was teaching for those people in the future, 20 or 40 years down the road, perhaps people as yet unborn. And I wasn't born when Mr. Gurdjieff was around. I came 8 years later. So it worked. Any comments, any questions? I hope everyone online, I know this is like a 10 or 15-second delay, has found this interesting. I've got, as I've said before, I've got a number of exercises. I've got what I call Allan's #1 Gurdjieff compilation exercise, where I go through a whole series of exercises. And that one's half an hour long. And these exercises on YouTube are really meant to be training wheels. We should be doing them ourselves. You've got to memorize the sources of divine rejoicings, revolts, and sufferings, and do that one when you're out walking. If you have to walk to the shop, or you have to walk, across the city or wherever, practice it. Practice the 10 bone exercise. Paul Beidler said that the 60 bone exercise going through the hands, and if you notice, I went through each one of those exercises 3 times. As per Mr. Gurdjieff, those exercises should be done 3 times. So the 60 bone exercise, going through the 15 bones in the hand, and or the 30 bones in the hands, or 30 bones in the foot, going through it 3 times. Paul Beidler said that we should do that exercise in the morning before we even get out of bed, just to go through that. And there's an exercise that I haven't talked about. I keep on saying I'm going to talk about it, where Mr. Gurdjieff talks about collecting emanations. And we collect those emanations through our hands and feet. This is where we collect things. And so I think doing things like the 60 bone exercise really brings us into an awareness of all of the digits in our hands and fingers. And the J.G. Bennett 60-point exercise, he goes through all the fingers, all the toes. The same with the exercise that was inspired by George Adi, who was one of Mr. Gurdjieff's British students who moved to Australia. He goes, they all include the fingers and the toes, because ultimately some of the higher exercises in terms of bringing emanations within ourselves occur in our limbs, and particularly our fingers. So it's very important to develop an awareness of all of our fingers, all of our toes, to develop an awareness of our appendages, our hands and feet, and various parts of our body. So there's the 60-point J.G. Bennett 60-point exercise that goes down 30 points one side of the body and up 30 points on the other side. Someone actually gave me a slightly different version of that. I mean to record that other version so that we will have both versions available. The Georgia D exercise, it starts with the right arm down, the left leg, or the right leg, left leg, right arm, up the spine, skull, then down the front part of the body to our reproductive organs. That's a different form of self-sensing. So the J.G. Bennett going down one side of the body, up the other, brings us into our body. The Georgia D takes us through the body in another way. Mr. Gurdjieff's filling exercise, like filling from the bottom of the feet up to the top of the head, brings us into this awareness in another way. And beyond the teachings, if you could throw all of the teachings out, practice the inner work. This is how we grow ourselves. The teachings provide us with a theoretical framework, an understanding. And with the teachings, when you begin to develop inner body and different things at different levels, you can begin to connect them to the teachings. So the state of waking sleep, we can't really be aware of ourselves in that state. But this next state up is personal consciousness. Personal consciousness, in today's world, we think of it as mindfulness. But it's an awareness of me here in this moment, the awareness of my body in this moment, the awareness of what I can see, what I can hear, or what my eyes see, what my ears hear, what my nose smells, what I taste in my mouth here in this moment. The awareness when I began with feeling. What am I feeling right now here in this moment? So the head brain, the body brain, and the feeling brain. The exercises are all designed to bring us here into this moment to grow our being. And when we begin to understand the difference between waking sleep, world 48, and world 24, on an inner level, through these practical inner exercises, the theory stops being theoretical. It stops being this intellectual framework, and it becomes something far more living, far more real. To go into the state of waking sleep, to become personally conscious, to go in the state of waking sleep, to become personally conscious, to go in the state of waking sleep, become waking, into the state of waking consciousness, to personally conscious. We can then go hydrogen 48, hydrogen 24, hydrogen 48, hydrogen 24, and we can get a clearer understanding of the theoretical framework. But without the practical inner work, without doing this on a sustained basis over time, nothing will happen. Mr. Gurdjieff said doing an exercise once is like pouring from the empty to the void. Doing it 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times is like pouring from the empty to the void. It's when we get up to 10,000 and 100,000 times that something really begins to develop and grow. I forget which one I think it was the Kathleen Spleen book. I forget the name of it. Discovering Mr. Gurdjieff or something like that. I read it a long time ago at the library here in Toronto. She talked about how there was a specific school of Tibetan Buddhism that you had to say a mantra 100,000 times before they would admit you into that as a student. So we've got to do these things over and over again. And as we perform these inner exercises over and over again, something coalesces within us. Something crystallizes within us. If I become mindful of my body, mindful of my hands, my feet, if I can sense my whole body as one organic whole, I am leaving I'm creating a world 24 impression behind within myself. Mr. Gurdjieff would have entails you use the word crystallization. One tiny little dusting of this crystallization is nothing. But if I do this over and over and over, the sensation of self, over and over and over, something grows, something develops within me. And this is how we grow our inner being, through doing these practical exercises, through working on ourselves, through finding out where we are leaking energy and then fixing those leaks so that we can redirect that energy into this inner work. At any rate, it's noon here now in Toronto. It's raining outside. We've had a real cold spell, and now hopefully we're heading back into spring. And I should have mentioned this, sorry, those of you who were expecting it an hour late. We've sprung forward. So this is the new time as it is now. Right now it's 12 o'clock, it's noon here in Toronto. And so for the next 8 months, we're gonna be on regular time. And then back in October, we go back into daylight savings time. So we're on our normal time again for the next 8 months. Thank you all for coming and participating. And for those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live, thank you. I will try and respond to the comments. I've got a client coming soon. I still have to upload last week's meeting, and I'll try and do this one at the same time, upload it so that it'll be available on YouTube. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Allan. Thank you very much.
Okay. End meeting.